as you know, it looks like there's going to be a military attack on Iran before the end of the year. Ideally, from the point of view of the Hawks, the right wing, it would take place in December after the election, it is hoped, say the Hawks, of President Romney. And then, a la 2008 December, when Gaza was bombarded by the Israelis, an interregnum between the transition from Bush to Obama, and so that Washington can seem to leave no fingerprints, you would have the bombing take place in December 2012. Now, this attack on Iran is intimately connected to China, because part of this hysteria about China, of course, is trying to get a stranglehold on the lifeblood of modern economies, which is oil, with Iran being a major producer. And with the, quote, victory, unquote, in Libya, the countries like Greece, which and also South Korea and Japan, and India, which had been getting a lot of oil from Iran, are now saying you can get your oil from Libya because production is going to be ramped up. You see the intimate connection between these two conflicts. You're having elections in France, and right now, I do think that it appears that Mr. Sarkozy will go down.
You think he's finished?
Yeah, it's time for him to write his memoirs. And with regard to the elections in Russia, it's too soon to tell. Although I think historians will be intrigued by how the North Atlantic media has covered the events in Russia, because you'd never know that in terms of the demonstrations that have been taking place in Moscow, that the main beneficiary might be the Communist Party of Russia, because they're the number 2 party.
Who they're supposed to hate.
Yeah, I thought that they didn't like the Communist Party. But but if you notice in all the coverage, they never mention who the number 2 party is. It's almost like, so I think they must think that they can get rid of Putin and then smuggle in somebody who's even more to the right. I assume that's the strategy. You never know with these people. So in that context, whether Canada, it's sort of unclear to me. I think that it might be possible for the more astute members of the Canadian ruling elite, and pardon me for interfering in your internal affairs, to try to engage in a kind of political arbitrage. That is to say, to try to take a middle position with regard to this conflict between China and the United States, and basically try to profit from both sides. It's just like the oil. Have a pipeline going to the west coast of Canada through British Columbia to ship oil to China, and have a pipeline going south to ship oil to the United States. So basically to be a middleman and profit. I mean, that's how the United States basically was catapulted to power in the 20th century. You remember World War I, for example, where the United States, it basically is inaugurated in 1914. The United States doesn't really enter until, I guess it's what, 1918? Yeah, or maybe 1918. So I see Japan doing that already, trying to sit in the catbird seat. It just entered into this swap agreement with China, which, in other words, they're going to do their trade not in dollars, but in yen and yuan. And at the same time, they're entering this sort of de facto alliance with India and the United States against China. So I assume that astute members of the Canadian ruling elite are going to try to play that double game.
Well, you know that Harper is on his way to China.
Ah.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, it was in the papers about 3 days ago. Yeah. He is on his way to China, and he's definitely softened his line. Well, I think you had called that. It
just makes more money. I mean, that's what it's all about. So I mean,
and I wanted to say,
why tail after Uncle Sam as they're about to go over another cliff? It doesn't make any sense to me.
Before you continue, I wanted to mention the fact that you pointed out that Brazil, that the EU called on Brazil to help bail them out of their financial crisis. Right. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, not only that, but if you look at the Brazilian economy, I don't know if Canadians are moving to Brazil, but there are a lot of U.S. people moving to Brazil. There are a lot of Haitians moving to Brazil. There are a lot of Portuguese moving to Brazil. There are a lot of Spanish moving to Brazil. It's a real gold rush, so-called, taking place. It's really remarkable, this transformation that this small planet is going through.
Let me say that Dr. Horne is Morris Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. I also would like to say that Melinda Francis and Mark Belkowski are handling the technical parts of the situation today. And I wanted to go to Gerald Horne, Dr. Horne, and to talk about, I wanted him to go talk about strife in Nigeria, and I guess we will talk about, I guess, a little bit about the African continent. But recently, last night, as a matter of fact, I was listening to CBC, and they had an interview on with Seun Kuti, Fela Kuti's youngest son, and he is not leading, but he is participating in these demonstrations. And to listen to him talk, I mean, he, you know, the way he was characterized in the beginning, I just thought he was just a young guy that was very, you know, hothead and following his father's footsteps in terms of being a, you know, just a rebellious guy. But when I listened to him speak last night, it seemed like he's really maturing as a person. They also asked him whether or not he was going to, you know, be running for president. He said basically he's not ready for that. But he's taking part in this this strife that's taking place, and they have the strikes all over Nigeria. And once again, they're trying to use the whole question of religion, Islam versus Christianity versus this, and we all know that, you know, it's not really a religious question. It's always, the class question is always behind the situation. So how would you assess the strife in Nigeria?
Oh, it's terrible. It's really terrible. You might recall that a few weeks ago on Christmas Day in northern Nigeria, which is heavily Islamic, there were these bombings of Christian churches, and then an apparent retaliation in southern Nigeria, which is not as heavily Islamic. There were attacks on mosques and religious centers, and then that led to an exodus of Muslims from the south to the north and Christians from the north to the south, and this is taking place in the context of strikes driven by a doubling of gasoline at the pump. This strike has been entered particularly by the Oil Workers Union. And this also may tie in, quite frankly, to the Iranian crisis, because already you see that the barrel of oil is creeping upwards because of the prediction that there will be an attack on Iran, and then oil supplies will drop, and then the price will go up. Now, prices already are rising in anticipation of an Iran bombing, and now with a strike of oil workers in Nigeria, you see another impetus for the price of oil to go up. So in a big country like this, where people drive quite a bit, even though it is an oil producer itself, this may affect consumers, because there's sort of an international price of a barrel of oil here, quite frankly. So it's a very serious crisis, and since Nigeria is the largest country by population on the continent of Africa, although the census figures aren't clear, but it's surely north of 100 million easily. It has impact upon that entire West African region, and in fact impact on the entire continent. And so I have to say, it's very distressing what's going on in Nigeria. It's complicated by the fact that President Jonathan, sort of an accidental president, you might recall that his predecessor, President Yar'Adua, who was from the north and was a Muslim, passed away in office, and they have this sort of informal bargain in Nigeria, where you'll have a president from the north who's Muslim, and then you'll have a president from the south who's not Muslim. And so after President Yar'Adua died in office, and then President Jonathan took his place, and President Jonathan's not Muslim, and some in that Muslim community were saying, well, you know, he jumped the line, he jumped the queue. Because he chose to run for election, people wanted him to step back. And so that's complicated things even further. You know, of course, that it wasn't so long ago, in the 1960s, that Nigeria had a very bitter civil war that was mostly concentrated in the east of the country, in Igbo land, with the secessionist attempt. And then things are complicated even further by the rise of this group Boko Haram, which you probably heard about, which is let's say, a so-called Islamic fundamentalist group that has been releasing videotapes about its activities in Nigeria. President Jonathan just said the other day that he feels his entire administration has been penetrated by Boko Haram, which is a bit frightening, I must say. So it's a dicey situation in Nigeria right now.
I wanted to say that I have a friend from Nigeria who used to teach at York University. And one time I was over his house, I was by his house, and he showed me Lagos' telephone book.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, look at this. And I saw all of these Portuguese names. And
Mm-hmm.
I said, what? You know, what's behind that? He says, well, these are the Africans that lived in Brazil,
Exactly.
came back home
Right.
to Africa, to Nigeria.
And to West Africa generally.
Yeah.
Because one of the first leaders of independent Togo, Sylvanus Olympio, was one of these repatriated
I never knew that.
Africans from Brazil who moved back. As a matter of fact, in my book, The Deepest South, which may be here, it's on the U.S., Brazil, and the African slave trade, I talk in part about how during the height of the African slave trade, which interestingly enough was at its height just before it collapsed, which is something to think about when we think about the future of capitalism. That, of course, U.S. nationals were captaining the trade, particularly from Mozambique and Angola, to Africa. But at the same time, just like the United States tried to establish tried to establish Liberia in the mid-19th century, contrary to what you read in the press today, it was a way for the United States to get rid of so-called free Africans, that is to say non-slave Africans, and get rid of them, send them all to Liberia. And the Brazilian elites were trying to do the same thing, to get rid of all the non-slave Africans, so you could have a one-to-one relationship between Africa and slaves, so there'd be no ambiguity. Because, you know, free African introduces an ambiguity, that is to say, you understand what I'm saying, disrupting that one-to-one relationship. And so that led to a lot of, quite a few. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure, it would be interesting to do a census to figure out how many of the Africans from North America wound up going back to West Africa versus how many of the Africans from Brazil wound up going back to West Africa.
On that particular point, Carlos Cooks, who was the head of the African Nationalist Pioneer Movement, and I think Carlos was born in the Dominican Republic and came to the United States. But Carlos Cooks basically had a problem with Liberia. He said it was started by Uncle Toms from America and the Caribbean.
I hear you.
And I should have said this in the beginning, but there is a new hemispheric organization.
Oh, yes.
And this new hemispheric organization includes Cuba,
everybody except the United States and Canada.
Cuba, Haiti.
Be careful with that kind of company.
Jamaica, so on and so forth. Venezuela, Bolivia. How do you assess the fact that the United States and Canada?
See, if I were part of the Canadian ruling elite, I'd be trying to engage in a bit of political arbitrage. I'd say, you know, I understand why you excluded the United States. As a matter of fact, we feel sort of uncomfortable sitting next to them. But you know, we're different.
Yeah,
I mean, we have a single-payer healthcare system. You know, we're involved in UN peacekeeping operations. We're not launching wars contrary to international law. So why are you excluding us? I mean, that's not ultra-leftist. I mean, you should have, you know, come on, man. You know, we can help you with regard to your relations with the North Atlantic countries. You know, we're the friendly face. I mean, if I were in Ottawa, that would be my line.
That's not Steve's line, because I'm looking at the news now, and this guy is, I mean, every issue from immigration, these guys have basically gone nuts. But I wanted you to could you talk more about a summary of what's taking place? What are the hot spots on the African continent that we should look at besides Nigeria?
Yeah. Well, let's start with South Africa, the continent's economic giant.